So welcome to Teaching to Converted. This is a new podcast put together by a couple of teachers, hopefully for the interest of students, educators, teachers, researchers, anyone with a passing interest in education. So I'm Sam.
And I'm James.
And together we've got about 10 plus years of experience across the state and the private sector. And we have a whole range of interests in teaching education, creativity, design in education, and a whole bunch more besides. So this week, we're taking a look at teaching standard number 2, which is to promote good progress and outcomes by pupils.
Surely the aim of the game, very much. Make sure students learn things.
Many aims.
Yeah.
Right then, and that's kind of split down into about 5 little subcategories as well. So to promote good progress and some good outcomes, we need to be accountable for pupils' attainment, progress and outcomes. So you've got to be accountable. You can be aware of pupils' capabilities and their prior knowledge, and plan your teaching to build on those. Guide pupils to reflect on the progress that they've made and their emerging needs. Demonstrate knowledge and understanding of how pupils learn and how this impacts on teaching, and encourage pupils to take a responsible and conscientious attitude to their own work and study.
Yeah, I like this one. Well, I like them all, but I like this one especially because it is what you're aiming to do as a teacher, basically, isn't it? If you're getting good progress, you must be doing most of the things right for that to happen.
That's very true. I feel like as well, this one, I don't know, I guess it informs a lot of the other ones, or it's an amalgamation of a lot of the other ones. So the idea of being accountable might link to setting high expectations in your personal and professional conduct. The idea of being aware of people's capabilities and their prior knowledge is to do with like T5 differentiation. Planning your teaching around that is to do with T4, which is all about planning. So by and large, this is a good kind of, I don't know, like a master standard.
Yeah, it's like the meta standard. It's the umbrella standard.
Very much so. That all the other standards from this point onwards seem to fall into for the most part.
It's like if you're not doing demonstrate good subject and curriculum knowledge, number 3 right, then you're probably not getting number 2. And if you're not doing number 1 right, you're also probably not getting number 2.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. If you're not planning, you're not getting progress. If you're not differentiating, some students aren't making progress. If you're not assessing, how can you show you've made any progress? So they definitely build on this one. So with that said, of those kind of 5 categories that this is broken down into, from being accountable to being aware of students' capabilities to guiding pupils to reflect, which of those substandards do you think perhaps affects progress the most?
Well, we could say, what do I think affects things the most?
That's what I want to know.
Yeah,
a little bit. That's what I want to know.
What I think affects things the most is I really like the guiding pupils to reflect and the demonstrate knowledge and understanding of how pupils learn. I think those 2 are my sort of favourites. We can only really talk about favourites because which one do I think affects it the most? Well, I'm just going to look at the research, which tells me exactly what affects things the most.
James, what does the research show?
Gets us very early onto the Education Endowment Fund, doesn't it? There's going to be a link here. I'm going to write this down because today I am taking notes as to what I should be linking.
You're going to minute this?
I am minuting it, yeah. The Education Endowment Fund is brilliant for this. They've got a teach and learning toolkit which tells you exactly how much progress everyone makes, how much things cost for like a school to run those things, and the evidence strength behind it. So basically, they've done all the reading for you. All you need to do is look at what they say. And it's brilliant. It's a really, really cool thing. So according to that, the one thing that gives the most progress, according to them, is feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's got pretty strong evidence, not the strongest, but pretty strong evidence that it's going to have a great effect. And apparently it makes a difference of, up to 8 months of additional progress.
Are you kidding me? 8 months of additional progress over the course of...
an entire year at school. Considering, we're off for about 12 weeks of the year, that's only an entire school year's difference.
That's obscene, isn't it? Isn't that ridiculous?
It's a little bit obscene.
I was reading...
And dirt cheap as well.
Yeah, I was reading through it before, and it talked about assessment for learning, and it said that one evaluation of assessment for learning indicated an impact of half a GCSE grade per student per subject. Like, what?
That is significant.
That is significant. So feedback then... I mean, feedback's one of those things where, yes, it's going to be really effective if it's being used correctly. And I think that's
in terms of using it correctly. So, walk me through what's your standard feedback for a class. Let's say you see them twice a week, you set some homework once a week or so. What's a good model of feedback?
So feeding back for me has to be something that they act on. If they're not acting on it, if they're not looking at it, then you're wasting your time. If your idea of feedback is writing in red pen their score on the homework at the top of the sheet, then they're not getting anything from that. While technically that is feedback, you got 60%, it's not effective feedback because they don't know necessarily where they went wrong. There's going to be a cross next to an answer. Why is there a cross?
I quite like that. I feel like, especially when I give feedback, I teach a lot of groups who, if you put a grade or you put some sort of summative percentage on there, no matter what else you write, no matter what comments, what suggestions, what extension questions, no matter what you do, they're just not interested. They see the grade and they go, oh, I got 70%. And they don't think, ooh, these comments and this extra bit will help me get the other 30%. They're just like, oh, I dropped some. Guess I'll just do the same thing again next time and hopefully I'll get better.
Yeah, I think I read something once that will probably not be referenced, just to save me time. I think I read something once where it said that there was a school or a teacher that just stopped putting grades on things. They only did sort of summative feedback, detailed feedback. So there was ticks and crosses, but there was no score at the end of it, which, like, it strikes me as a good idea. Like, ideally, that's a good idealistic thing to do, but it doesn't necessarily solve the problem because students can just add up themselves for the most part. Where do you think sort of peer assessment and self-assessment fits into this? Do you think that's a useful feedback tool, or is that just dodging the feedback?
No, I think it's quite useful actually. It depends how you do it and who you do it with, but I think it's useful. I mean, especially with exam classes, a chance for them to see mark schemes.
Yeah.
Especially in my subject, where as long as you're essentially hitting a few keywords at GCSE to structure your answer, you're going to pick up a lot more marks than if you're just haphazardly kind of rambling on.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of value in them seeing mark schemes. I think there's a lot of value in them seeing how other people are answering questions potentially.
Yeah.
Whether they look at that and say that's a really good way to answer, or that's a really bad way to answer, or this answer is only getting half marks for whatever reason. I think there's value in that.
Yeah.
I don't think it works to some extent if the students aren't thinking about it. It's quite an active process, and if they sit there and it's not intuitive because what's in the mark scheme isn't quite worded in the answer that's written down, I think they really struggle. And you get 100 hands up saying, does this count, sir? Is this worth a mark, sir? Is this right? What about this? And you're like, well, is that what it says on what scheme? Well, no, but they use the word. Well, if it's not in the right context, it doesn't mean anything. So
yeah,
I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword.
Yeah, we've all been there. Especially, like, I'm thinking as a science teacher, the 6-mark answers on GCSE papers, trying to peer and self-assess those is such a nightmare because, like you say, they all put their hands up individually. But something else I quite like to do with sort of peer and self-assessment, especially like you say with mark schemes, is also have a look at the examiner's reports. Do you ever do that?
Yeah, quite often.
Yeah.
Quite often.
Bring up the examiner's reports alongside, and that way the examiners will write comments about, which students did best on what. And it quite often is good for pointing out common misconceptions with the students. And then they can quite often see that in their own work. It's like, oh, I did that. That's why I dropped a mark. And that sort of encodes it a little bit better into their long-term memory. It means they're less likely to make the same mistake again. If they're saying like 2/3 of the students did this, then they're like, okay, that's something I need to nail, because if I want to be in the top third, I need to be not doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just pointing out the pitfalls, there's so many times, certainly in my subject, in biology, and I guess across the board, where there is this pitfall question, or there is a twist in the question, or students answer one half and get 2 out of the 4 marks, so they don't get the other 2. And that sort of reminder to say you're not on your own. A lot of people have made the mistake. This is how you answer this sort of question from the examiner can be quite helpful, I think.
Yeah, I say to the students, where are the bear traps in this one? And quite often they can point them out, especially in physics, because they're always trying to catch you out with things like units, for example. Such an obvious thing, but quite often it's missed. And I'll say to the students, where are the bear traps in this one? The students will put their hands up. They'll say, oh, they've given it you milliseconds instead of seconds. Thank you. You need to convert it first, that sort of thing. So just to make sure we don't get bogged down too much in feedback, which obviously is brilliant. Maybe we could do an entire session on feedback in the future. But to continue going down the Education Endowment Fund, the second one, and a personal favourite of mine, is metacognition and self-regulation.
A personal favourite of mine as well.
Oh, I love that word.
Absolutely.
I see the word metacognition written down, especially on things like inset days, and my mouth starts to water. Like, oh, here we go. Here we go. Stuff that I'm actually interested in. I'm not just doing safeguarding again. Don't get me wrong, safeguarding, very important. But when you've done it for like 4 times, and God help the people that have been in the business for 30 years and they're still doing safeguarding every inset. Rough.
Yeah. Metacognition is just that thing that spices it up a little bit.
It's like
just that bit exciting.
Very much the chili powder. It's the cumin of ingredients for me.
I like that. that. So in terms of what the Education Endowment Fund say about it, really strong evidence, stronger evidence to say that this makes good progress than feedback actually, and it makes about 7 months of additional progress for students. The impact is an additional 7 months, and again the cost is basically nothing if you've been educated about it, you know what metacognition is, and you've got a few resources and ideas put together to execute it in your classroom. It costs you basically nothing.
There's an abundance of references and resources out there for teaching you about metacognition. The reading's really good. You can find various podcast episodes on it and things like that. But none of those will be referenced. you just search for it, you'll find stuff.
Can't go far wrong.
No.
And I mean, I guess, what was I going to say? With metacognition, for those who don't know, the idea of metacognition is just like you can learn physics, or you can learn English, or you can learn how to juggle. You can learn all these things. It's the idea of, can you learn how to learn better? Can you learn how to learn more efficiently? And yes, of course you can. You can definitely put strategies and ideas in place for a student to learn better and to learn more efficiently, and that's the whole point of metacognition. So it's definitely, as a school of thought, split into a few different categories, ideas, I guess. Partially, it's to do with getting students to reflect, which is this big idea when it comes to pupil progress, T2, getting students to reflect on their performance and to evaluate and to say, how could I improve and what did I do wrong and how can I change it next time? It's about developing short-term and long-term memory skills. It's about developing all these different study skills at once and just getting students to really reflect on all of those.
It's pointing out what the tools are that they're using anyway. So that's why it's so easy to do in a classroom, but you need to have the knowledge and you need to have the metacognitive skills yourself to be seeing what it is that they're doing. So say, for example, students weren't reflecting on their work, or they were being, even something as simple as being easily distracted. It's getting them to see when they're being distracted and address that. It's sort of getting them to look down on what they're doing at the minute and say, what am I doing wrong? What am I doing right? What could I do better?
Absolutely. Do you think, kind of as an extension to that then, because it's so important, because it has the potential to make all this progress, do you think it should be its own standalone subject at school?
I think it'd be really interesting to do that. I think one of the reasons that we could do that, and it's something that I believe has worked in schools where people have taught it as a standalone subject, and it's worked. But in my mind, it's going to work best if it's being blanketed across the school. If every teacher has the skills and the tools, the toolkit to be able to teach students metacognition as they're going through it, then that is what will secure it with the students. They're looking at it all the time. They'll see it in different examples, different contexts, different subjects, and it will help them to be able to point out, oh, this is that thing that I was learning about in English. This is that thing I was learning about in Spanish. It works best when it's a whole school approach rather than one teacher trying to teach all the students how to do it.
I completely agree. I mean, it's one of these things where you could make the debate that it is a style of teaching, and therefore individual teachers may or may not do it, depends if it fits with their style. But I feel like to some extent, especially considering what the teaching standards are, considering this is T2, it's like part of your job.
Yeah.
I think all teachers have some responsibility to be getting students to reflect and think, what could they do better? What are they doing wrong and right at that moment? How can they apply their skills in new and different ways? What skills they need to develop that they're currently lacking? So I don't think, I think as a standalone thing, there's nothing wrong in introducing it and getting people thinking about it and talking about it. But I completely agree. I feel like it should be just interwoven into people's teaching. It should just be in classrooms. It should be, especially when you question students, when you're walking around the room and you're saying, what are you up to? What are you doing? What else? It should always be like in your vocabulary as part of your kind of questioning technique as you're going around.
Exactly. It's something that I try to do with my teaching. Like I taught my year 8 maths class, and my year 7 maths class actually, about the zone of proximal development, Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, and I made it part of their vocabulary. So I could say, right guys, on this next topic, so say we just learned about scattergraphs, and there's then a bank of questions on scattergraphs in the textbook. I could just say, start at question 1, but that's not necessarily the best thing for them. Whereas what I say to them instead is I go, right guys, the questions typically get more difficult the further you go through. I say to them, find your ZPD, and they all do that, and they got really good at that towards the end of the term, where I could say, find your ZPD. They all knew what that meant, and they would go and find the area that challenges them without being too difficult.
Speaking of what it means, for those who are listening who aren't, I suppose, teachers of 2, 3, 4 years, perhaps PGC students or people who qualified years and years and years ago and who haven't come across it, do you want to give a quick rundown of zones of proximal development? What do we mean when we're talking ZPDs?
Well, it's very much, my students quite often, at first they said, do you mean the Goldilocks zone? Because that's another way I'd use to describe it to them. So there's I'm sure we've all heard the story of Goldilocks and the 3 bears, but the general gist of it is, like, Goldilocks would go to eat some porridge, and one of the porridges would be too cold, one of them would be too hot, and one of them would be just right. And there's very much the same in teaching and learning. If the student, you give them something too easy, they're not making any progress. They could do it without any help, without the stuff that you taught them anyway, and they just fly through the work and they don't really learn anything from it. Whereas if you give them something that's too hard, if I went into my year 8 maths class and gave them degree level calculus, they're going to throw it back at me and say, what a waste of my time. Well, they're not going to throw it back. They're pretty well behaved.
I mean, they might do. I thought you were going to say throw up. I'm imagining you put it in front of them.
Shunned upon sight. This is so difficult. I'm so anxious about not being able to do it. I've thrown up all over myself.
His eyes look at it and his brain thinks, this makes no sense to me. I must have been poisoned. I'm just not running right. And as a result, the nausea kicks in.
I've never set work that hard. Thank God. But so
the idea is just like kind of find that middle ground where students are challenged, but not challenged to the point where they say, you know what, I can't do this, so I'm not going to bother.
The research shows that's where they make the most progress, in that zone of proximal development. So teaching that, the reason we brought this up is because that is a metacognitive skill, being able to work out the level of difficulty that you should be working at, and being able to self-regulate what is too easy and what is too hard, and sticking to that, the sweet spot.
Absolutely. And in terms of kind of your experience with it, do students have the skills to take responsibility for their own progress in your experience, or do you think that more kind of lands on the teacher?
I think it depends quite a lot on the class, actually. You get some classes and it's almost random. It depends on the big characters in the class, but there'll be some classes where students take control. They have a great attitude from day one and they work really well on the work that you set. You'll get some classes where students just don't want to. They're just never in the mood for deciding for themselves, deciding what is, giving them the most progress. Are they making progress? What could they do better? It can be a motivational thing, whether they've got the motivation. But whether they've got the motivation or not, if you've not taught them the skills to do it, you've not pointed out the things that they should be doing, made them intentional with their learning, then that is kind of on you as a teacher.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair point. The idea of, I suppose, being intentional in what you do and making sure that they aren't just, doing the worksheet because you put it in front of them, and doing the worksheet because you put it in front of them, and doing the worksheet. I think a lot of students have this idea of, I'm going to show up, I'm going to be given work to do, I'm going to muddle through with what's currently in my head, and then I'm going to leave again, and it's just kind of ad nauseum, just rinse and repeat that same thing over and over again. So to be intentional, to get a student who thinks, what did I do last time? What can I read before the lesson to refresh myself? What skills did I pick up that I can apply to this new problem? How can I think about it in a different way? I know a lot of students are very reluctant to applying the new things they've been taught to try and solve the problems that they perhaps can't solve with their own usual bag of tricks.
Yeah, that's a good point. Definitely. Metacognition, huge fan of it. Do some reading if you're not already sure. If you're a PGC student, by the way, this is a really interesting area to read on. I remember when I was doing my PGCE, there was the hats. Do you remember that? Those, what were they called? Did you do the coloured hats?
The coloured, I don't think I did the coloured hats.
Oh, where the idea was they had like different hats for different skills, and that was supposed to be giving them metacognition. It was this huge fad that schools picked up because they thought it was like, right, this is metacognition. They'll be, if we do this, and the students hated it because all the teachers were being made to do it instead of sort of having their own novel approach or sort
this
of
sounds a little bit like the whole VAK, visual auditory.
It's kind of in the same
kinesthetic nonsense.
Yeah, the thinking hats. Let me just have a quick Google. I can't remember the 6 thinking hats. This is it. So the different colours. There was different colours depending on what the thinking was. So there was the white hat was facts. Whether it's just a straight piece of knowledge. Red hat was emotion. It was like all these different hats, and the idea is you put them on your head. And some teachers had actual physical hats, and the students put them on their head to answer the questions in a sort of. The red hat was feelings. The black hat was cautions.
All this is helping progress is like your class's infestation of head lice.
Yeah.
This is horrible.
Let's share the head lice.
This is the worst thing. I hate that. Yeah, I feel like in terms of metacognition, again, this goes out to PGC students and people who perhaps have never heard of it before. For me, it really, really shaped my teaching style, and it continues to shape the way that I choose activities, the way that I choose assessments, the way that I design different activities and different portions of lessons. And I think if you try and tell all teachers, this is the way that you must apply it to your practice, it isn't going to work. I think you need to give ideas and solutions and ways that it can be used, and then let teachers run with it and build it into their own style of teaching. Maybe what we need is a podcast in the future, a little session on kind of how you develop a style of teaching and what works for one individual compared to what works for another one.
Yeah, that's true. I personally think so. For example, my old head of department, my ex-head of department, she was a great physics teacher, been doing it a long, long time. But if I was to teach her lesson with her resources, and she was to teach my lesson with my resources, neither of us would have a good lesson. Her teaching style was very, very different to mine, which is fine. We both made progress at the end of the day. We both met QTS standard 2, but the different teaching styles, some styles will work well for one teacher, some styles will work well for another. There was times she walked into my classroom, was horrified at what was happening because students, were talking to one another. There was some students were talking about things that were irrelevant, and I was like, it's not ideal. I'll pick them up in a minute. I'm just going to, give them a minute to let their brain reset. And in her mind, that was not okay. She liked a silent classroom, students working on questions, and it was, there are pros and cons to both.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's folly to suggest that one style and one system or one way is kind of the only way that it can be done. I've observed teachers who are amazing orators, and they can hold the entire class in the palm of their hand and talk the way through the lesson with no slides and nothing else prepared. And they're questioning and the way that they pick and choose their words, and the students they pick and choose to answer certain questions based on their knowledge of the student's ability. Like it's amazing. Yeah. And I cannot do that.
No.
There's teachers who, I don't know, they almost have built a reputation around themselves as they're going to be a hard ass and they're going to be stern, but you're going to get a grade at the end, and you might not enjoy it, but if you sit there and you work, like, you're going to come out the other end, a really good chemist or a really good English student or whatever it is. And
Yeah.
again, if that works for that teacher, that's great. I can't bring myself to do it. It's just not my style of
No.
teaching. It doesn't
Yeah.
fit my personality.
They are very much the celery of teaching.
A little bit, yeah.
They'll
But I
get
like celery, but I don't like that.
Celery. There's something interesting here on the EEF. Apparently, according to the research that's been done, though it isn't the strongest evidence base, setting or streaming gives -1 month of progress, which is interesting.
Yeah, I've heard about this a few times, and quite a few schools that I've worked at swear by setting, and they always use setting. Even when I was at school, I was set for 5 years from 11 to 16.
Yeah.
I don't, having taught both ways, having taught in setted classes and in mixed classes, I got to say I prefer mixed groups.
Yeah, it's interesting because in my mind, the teachers all say, well, I've taught primarily mixed ability through my teaching career. It's only the last couple of years I've picked up a couple of classes of maths which have been setted. And in my experience, I'm not surprised that some teachers say they prefer it, because it's not designed necessarily for the students to find it better. It's designed for the teachers to find it better.
I think so, yeah. I think it's that idea of, it almost feels a little bit lazy. The idea of if we put all the best kids in set 1 and all the worst kids in set 5 or whatever, then that's my differentiation kicked off and done for me, because I'll just set harder work to the top set and easier work to the bottom set. It's like that Simpsons scene where Bart's saying, we're going to catch up to the advanced class by going slower than the advanced class.
Yeah.
And it just, for me, no wonder people aren't making progress. I think, if memory serves, I'm sure this is going to be such an anecdotal episode of, if memory serves, there's one study a few years ago that I read.
Yeah.
So by all means, correct me if I'm wrong. I seem to remember that students, when you have them in mixed groups, brighter students don't do any worse. They do fine. Just like they always would. And the weaker students do better as a result of having the stronger students there to help them, or to discuss, or to bounce ideas around, or to ask questions, or just as a motivational thing, because they can see what their competition is like. Whereas when you separate them, the bright students still make all the progress that a bright student was going to make, but now these weaker students have been really thoroughly demotivated by being put in set 4, set 5, set 6, surrounded by people that they might feel that they're much brighter than. I find quite often in schools as well, you get a mix in the lower sets of students who really actually could do with more hands-on help and smaller class sizes, or a teaching assistant or whatever, and they're thrown in with students who are bright but have like quite strong kind of behavioral problems.
Yeah.
And they're just thrown in there to not disrupt the other classes that might get some good results.
Yeah. I remember I once taught a bottom set physics class, and there was, I think, 5 in the class. And they knew they had been the bottom set since day 1, and they knew they were the bottom set. And because they were that bottom set, and they may not have been bright academically, but emotionally they were very bright, and they could read teachers' opinions of them, even if they never said it, just from the way they acted, the way they behaved towards the students. And like you say, there was 1 or 2 students in there who could have gone on to really good things, but instead, not only were they classed together, academically together, they were also socially a very tight-knit unit. They'd been friends for donkey's years. Nobody else really hung around with them that much. It tended to be those guys all together all the time, and it just led to this almost toxic sort of approach to learning, where they had just resigned themselves to the fact that they were never going to get anywhere, and it was really sad to see. And are you willing to trade that in for the teacher who's teaching top set, having a bloody field day, having a great time of it? They're just teaching really bright kids and feeling like they're number 1, where in actual fact, are they really making any more progress for being in that top set?
That's the thing. I think if you're going to set students, the real challenge is definitely in teaching and helping to improve, middle and bottom sets. Those brighter sets are like, and teachers will say like they're the easy ones. It's nice to divvy them up and make sure everyone gets at least one nice bright top set of, good kids who will behave and sit and do the work and find it, enjoyable. Which is a bit of a shame, because everyone should find it enjoyable. But like you say, if you typecast them from day 1, and you say you're bottom of the pile, and we're just gonna, teachers aren't gonna be enthusiastic about teaching you, and we'll just bash you from one teacher to the next year on year, so everyone has a turn with you.
Yeah.
No wonder they're not remotely interested in school or in progress or in doing better. Like, the system is failing those kids in my mind.
Yeah, that's a good point. Something here that I think you quite like to talk about: collaborative learning. I know you're a huge fan of this.
Am I putting me on the spot there?
Well,
Collaborative
we
learning.
don't have to talk about it if you don't want to.
It's too late.
Collaborative.
You've
It's something
thrown
that
me in there now.
I've heard you speak about before, where it's sort of that group work approach, which I mean, I
That's
personally,
true.
yeah, I personally really like it. I have messed with project-based learning before, if I'm honest, to mixed results. I find that I can get carried away with the project side of it and forget about the learning side of it a little bit. Like at the end of it, we have these amazing models that students have made of, like, for example, I did a tiny house project with my maths class to teach them area and volume and making nets and things like that. And they ended up with these amazing models. And, if they'd have sat a test, they didn't necessarily make that much progress on the test.
True. Yeah, but I guess to some extent, that begins to beg the question: Are we teaching them skills? Are we teaching them material? Are we teaching them a way to think about solutions and problems? And are we assessing it in the right way? Because, like you say, while they might not have done well on that test, if the test was to build a model to certain specifications and use the equations to build a model of a certain area or a certain volume, I imagine they'd be absolutely fine with it.
Yeah.
So I guess, I don't know. I feel like this is perhaps better saved for teaching standard 6 on assessment, but I do feel like the way in which we assess students in this country is iffy. We all seem to go for this bog standard written kind of summative test that will just generate a grade at the end. And I get why we have to do that. There's definitely reasons why it is useful to do a standardized test like that. But I feel like just assessing everyone in the same way isn't necessarily great. I mean, I'm not the best at essays and longer form written tests. Maybe that's why I went into the sciences.
You're speaking to a physics teacher here.
Exactly. Yeah. If I can just whack down some maths and some equations, get some buzzwords, keywords down, and just have a solution which is like A therefore B therefore C therefore D. In my head, that just fits really neat. Yeah. If you want me to analyze a poem and tell you how I empathize with the main character, no.
You're gonna get the written version of a shrug.
I don't know how you write a shrug, but maybe just crunch up the paper.
Just draw on a little person shrugging. That's what I'd do.
Nice. Even that I would struggle with. So I feel like, I've never enjoyed that sort of thing. I remember at university, a lot of my assessments were all write an essay on this, write an essay on that, which would be a good way to show off all the reading you've done, which is what they're after. But I just hated it. I couldn't do it. Whereas if you give me a Viva, if you say to me, you're not going to write it down, but let's have a conversation about it, I can talk your ear off all day. That's not a problem. I'm more than happy to do that. Just like we have these podcasts and I'm doing it right now. And I think students are the same. Some are really articulate, but they're not great written down. Some are amazing written down, but they can't actually explain themselves to you word for word, like at all.
Yeah, I think there's a very good reason why podcasts are usually more popular than blogs, because who's going to sit down and read a blog in this day and age? And it's very much the same.
I'll tell you what a surprise I found. I was looking at some enrichment work for students the other day, and the school that set this kind of digital online enrichment work, they were saying, it's if you can find the time to read a book in the next 8 weeks, that would be great. And if not, you can do some magazines or you can do some articles. Now, maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm biased. Maybe I've had a weird. I mean, I definitely have had a weird upbringing. But I feel like 8 weeks, read a book.
Yeah.
I don't know what's happened to students. Maybe I'm out of touch. Maybe life's changed. Maybe now everything's on devices and it's all digital and it's all immediately consumable and it's all in short bursts. Maybe things have changed and maybe people don't read like they used to. But I tell you what, if you want students to make good progress, if you're thinking, how can my kid, whether they're 7 years old, 8 years old, 10 years old, 12, 14 years old, how can they make good progress? How can they develop skills and get better? Get them reading.
Get them reading. I love a good book. But my problem is that as soon as the writing gets sort of thick and turgid, I really struggle. like academic papers. Oh. I'm so keen on reading an academic paper. About halfway through the first chapter, I'm like, oh, this is bran flakes with no milk. This is seriously crunchy.
I get that. I've got, yeah. Normally I find a paper goes one of two ways when I open it up, because I'm obviously doing that masters at the moment. It's just papers all the time. Either it's going to be written in such a way as the author really wants to make their point really clear to the layman and really clear to anyone of any practice who's going to read it. And it's any technical jargon or term is usually defined and then used there on out, and it's largely fine. And it's broken up quite nicely, and the ideas flow quite logically. Or you've got someone who they're so niche in their area. They've got this such a specific topic, and they're trying to talk about the finest of fine points, that they have to use language that is going to prevent people from really reading it. It's going to be completely inaccessible unless you've got a real background in that area, because they need to be so specific. They need to be careful about every word they use, and those are difficult.
I was watching a Steven Pinker presentation, which I will reference. That's one that I will throw in there. Quite often a sort of a controversial figure, Steven Pinker, but he gave a presentation on styles of writing, which I really liked. And he gave an example of Richard Feynman, who was a physicist. And
I'm familiar with Feynman.
Oh, aren't we? Aren't we all? Yeah. If you're not, you should be, by the way, people listening. Richard Feynman. Learning.
Speaking of kids reading books, maybe that can be our GCSE read of the week. Richard Feynman's, what's it called? Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman.
Yeah.
Great book. Absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, I love the guy. Because his style of writing, while he was an absolutely cutting-edge scientist, like really, really top end theoretical physicist of his day, he wrote in such a way that he really wanted people to follow along. It wasn't about him, even though he was this huge personality. It was about bringing people along on that journey with him. Whereas you can find, especially in academic papers, it's almost like a tool for the hubris of the writer. Look how intelligent I am, and look at the scale of my vocabulary, and it's so difficult to read as a result.
I think I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I think I agree that the language is really tough for the layperson, and to get into a field is like bloody hard to know where to begin reading to pick up the tone. I mean, I remember one of my first master's papers was talking about essentialism and instrumentalism and things like that. I'm like, I've got no social sciences background like this. I'm a more of a pure scientist. Like I have no idea what these are, and I had to like bone up on it in order to actually make the papers accessible. I feel like if you're writing for the specific audience of people in your field, it's probably fine. Like it's probably absolutely fine.
Yeah, academic papers aren't aimed at the layman, are they?
That's like sometimes they are, I think, but quite often perhaps they're not going to be. And it depends, is that paper being written because it really wants to help teachers on the ground, or is it being written because it wants to critique some really niche part of educational theory? If it's trying to explain to someone this is how connectivism works, that's one thing. If it's saying this is a criticism of connectivism and a way to bounce some ideas around, within my peer group, within my field, of course that's going to be way less accessible for us.
Yeah, you're right. I bow to you. You've changed my mind. One thing I have spotted again on the Education Endowment Fund website. This toolkit is homework. It talks about primary and secondary homework. Or in primary school, you get 2 months of progress. So they say it's still worth doing. But the homework for the secondary is 5 months of progress, so it's much more worth doing, which I think is interesting. Because we've all heard the teachers who use this as an excuse where, the studies show that homework doesn't even make any difference, which I think is interesting.
Yeah. And I wonder why there's that difference as well, because, I mean, is it a biological thing where older students have different kind of brain biology and they're more developed and they're at a point where they can get more out of homework? Is it to do with maybe what I think, thinking about it, though this is a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, I guess, I wonder if in primary school, by and large, you have one teacher, you get set less homework, and if you're going to get set one homework a week, it's either going to be an English homework or a maths homework or a phonics homework or something, maybe, I don't know. Whereas with secondary, all of a sudden you get to secondary school, you've got 10 teachers, you've got 11 teachers, you've got homework every night, you're getting into this academic mindset at home, you're developing a proper workspace at home. All these other ideas that fall into what is kind of good education, the idea of establishing space, the idea of having an area to do that work, and the idea that you're actually, because you're not doing one big homework for your teacher, one project at primary, you're doing 3, 4, 5 smaller pieces of work. It's almost, I guess, a form of space practice to some extent.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think space practice, when I do set homework, I tend to try and make it spaced. It's something that I'm certainly going to try and do in the future. I was showing you I was using the Fibonacci sequence for space practice to make sure that I'm getting spacing at the right amount. That's something I really did quite a deep dive into. It's kind of strange. But the idea is that half of the homework I set, like if I set a 30-minute homework, 15 minutes of it is going to be the spaced practice, sort of like a mini test, where the grades I'll take them in, but they don't matter at all. They absolutely do not matter. It's super low stakes. The students, it doesn't matter whether they do well or not. And if they don't want to give me a grade, I say, fine, that's okay. But that spaced practice, I think, is a really good thing for homework, because quite often you get homework that's set. And I think this is where I can disagree with homework not being given correctly. If you did a lesson on a subject, and then at the end of the lesson, maybe the last 20 minutes or so, they'd practice some questions on it, and then you just did more practice questions for homework, that is where I sort of lose interest in a way. I much prefer setting homework that is, okay, here's one question from the work today, but also here's a question from the work a term ago.
I agree with that.
Makes sense.
No, it does. I mean, yeah, for people listening, space practice is this idea that rather than teaching in blocks where, as a biologist, to take an example, I don't know, 2 weeks on the circulatory system, 2 weeks on the respiratory system, 2 weeks on the immune system, instead of just going block, 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 the idea is that you would space your homeworks and things out so that actually you're getting a little bit of everything at regular intervals. And every time you go through it, if you're getting a bit better at it, you can leave the interval a bit longer. If it's not fresh in your mind and you're doing worse at it, you begin to factor those in a bit more regularly.
Yeah, if you want some help with that, I was talking about the Fibonacci series way of working it out. Not everybody's a mathematician, so if you do need any help with that, get in touch either through Facebook or through YouTube or whatever means we at the time of listening we currently have. If you want, I can send you a spreadsheet with it all worked out. I did that. I'm a kind of a sado, but if you want that,
amazing.
Get in touch. Yeah, get in touch.
I was going to say as well, you can definitely encourage students to do this sort of thing as well. This is the sort of thing that you can actually apply in a load of different ways. So for kids trying to make progress, especially on the run up to like GCSEs, A levels, things like that, if they've got flashcards, a really simple strategy is that they get 3 boxes for their flashcards to live in. One says daily, one says weekly, one says monthly. They go through their physics flashcards, test themselves. Any they get right, go into the weekly box. Any they get wrong, go into the daily box. And then they go through the next day, and then they get right, go into the weekly box. At the end of the week, they go through the weekly box. Anything they get right goes into the monthly box. Anything that they got wrong goes back into the daily box, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And it's just a way to kind of shuffle around what you're doing, so the things you're comfy with become less frequent, and you're always pushing and challenging yourself on the things that you weren't too confident with. I think it is very easy for students to try and subvert the system a little bit and just revise and just work on and just limit themselves to what they already do well, because it's satisfying. It's nice to get it right. It's nice to just nail it every time.
They'll do that subconsciously, won't they?
Absolutely, they will.
So, something that is really good for that, I don't know if you've ever used it, the app Cram.
I don't think I have.
Oh, the Cram is a flashcard app where the students can either download sets of ready-made flashcards, or, which I think we'll both agree is better, make their own. What they can do then is build up a back catalogue of, so they say they'll make a section of flashcards called biology, and they'll make a back catalogue as they go through of flashcards, and then they can test themselves on those flashcards. So the questions that the flashcards that they get wrong will come up then more often. and the questions
I like that.
they get right will come up less often, and it automatically builds that into the software. So it's
That makes sense. I've not seen Cram, but I have seen programs and apps like that have the algorithm behind them where the more you get right, the less they come up, and the more you get them wrong, the more frequently they come up.
Yeah, they can be quite a good activity for lessons as well. If you're the kind of school that is quite sort of hands-on with technology, say, right guys, at the end of a lesson, if you've got nothing else sort of planned, you've got 5 or 10 minutes spare. It happens all the time, doesn't it? We've all been there. Or the next thing you wanted to start is going to take too long, so you kind of can't start it. Just go, right guys, get out your devices. I want to see you doing Cram for 10 minutes. And there's games as well where they use the flashcards, but it's kind of like a cross between that and like a Candy Crush kind of game. So it's good, and they can play games and they're learning almost by accident, which is what we're all a fan of, that accidental learning.
Yeah. So just trick them into it.
Yeah. Cram app. There will be a link. I've already written that down. It'll be easy to find. So easy mode.
Perfect. Good
yeah,
stuff.
I'm also going to give you a link to the Learning Scientists blog entry. I love these guys, Learning Scientists, and their blog entry on how to use flashcards properly. So that will also be there. Cool.
Perfect. Good stuff. I'm just flicking through the Education Endowment Fund. It's interesting as I flick through the things that don't have, like, there's good evidence to say that these things don't help out very much. It's interesting that mentoring doesn't do a lot. Block scheduling, just teaching everything in blocks, really doesn't do anything for you.
Yeah.
The idea of getting a kid to repeat a year actually has a really negative effect on them, quite significantly, to the tune of like -4 months of progress, even though you think you're helping them out.
Yeah.
If you set them, it's not necessarily good for them. But it's interesting to look at what does work. Obviously, feedback and metacognition that we've talked about are the major ones, the big ones.
They're the biggest.
There's collaborative learning at the top. The idea of project and problem-based learning really lend themselves to collaborative learning. The idea that students are working together on things. And that also ties in with another thing that makes a lot of progress, which is the idea of peer tutoring, which I think as soon as you set students, you get away from reliable peer tutoring. You no longer have, the brighter, comfortable student who can answer the question for the weaker student sat next to them, or to split them into groups and assign different roles to them. Kind of a Harkness approach, I guess. You can struggle to do that, I guess, when they're setted. But I'm just flicking through and I'm seeing like things that are helping out. Reading comprehension strategies, helping kids to read better, plus 6 months of progress. So like I said, get kids to read books. Phonics, so again, language, reading, getting the idea of words on the page to words coming out of your mouth, plus 4 months. Oral language interventions, plus 5 months. Amazing, absolutely crazy. That just, if you can, but I suppose that's how we assess students to some extent. A lot of our academic education is to do with reading, and it is to do with communicating.
Yeah, that's a good point. Doesn't matter what subject you're studying. I really like the Einstein quote for that, and this kind of ties back to what we were talking about before as well with written exams. He said, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it'll go through its entire life believing it's a failure. And as a physics teacher, I love Einstein anyway. Good egg. But that's a personal favourite quote of mine from him. I love it. And it's that idea of, but, all fish should be able to read, in a way.
In a sense, yeah. In a sense.
If you're not teaching
or rather, rather, I guess the idea is like, try to encourage that fish to read and build those skills early so they're not caught out of water way later down the line when it's kind of actually too late. And it's tricky, it really is, but the evidence is there that is a surefire way to help students make progress really quickly. Other things I like are mastery learning. So are you familiar with mastery learning?
It's something that I've heard a little bit about, but I'd love for you to explain it to me if you've got a bit of detail there.
I mean, a little bit, not tons and tons, but in a nutshell, the idea is that you're gonna you got your regular syllabus, you've got your content, whatever subject matter and units and things that you're trying to teach. The idea is you're not gonna abandon it and progress from there until students have mastered it.
Yeah, it's
so
kind
for me, go
on. This is what my dad was always saying with fractions, decimals, and percentages. he said that it always scared him that students can leave school not knowing how to do those. And his idea is, he didn't know it at the time, but it was to do with mastery learning, where he said teachers should not be moving on. And this is me like quoting my dad, like the font of all wisdom and knowledge. It's, sorry, Dad, if you're listening, you're not. It's the idea is the students don't move on from fractions, decimals, and percentages until they've all got it nailed. You know, and I can see. I'm just thinking about it as a classroom approach. I can see the difficulties, and I can see why teachers will be scared of it as well.
That's the thing. I mean, when I look at what I'll be teaching this term, I know that between now and, I guess, what are we, 5-6 weeks away from half term, you know, I've got 2 weeks circulatory system, 2 weeks respiratory kind of breathing system, 2 weeks infectious disease. And if I don't go at that pace, work will get missed and there will not be time to catch that work up at all. So how you achieve mastery learning is really difficult in the way that schools are currently set up.
Yeah.
I think there's I don't know, I feel like maybe apprenticeships are better at this. I feel like if you do an apprenticeship, you learn a skill or you learn a craft, and you can't really progress to point B until you've kind of really mastered and got a hold of point A, because everything builds on everything else. Whereas we've just kind of got to do a bit of work, do a test, do a homework, do a bit of work, do a test. You got 60%, whatever, we're moving on now. And that's what mastery learning is saying, like, don't do that. They got 60%, they're not ready to move on yet. You need to really give them the time and make sure that they can get this nailed on before you just introduce even more new stuff. It's crazy to me. I remember having students who at GCSE would get C's and D's in biology, and they were allowed to continue for the A level. Now imagine getting a D, getting, you know, what is on paper a fail. Is something that an employer isn't looking for. And then you say, you know what, can you make it harder for me? But the school goes, yeah, absolutely, that sounds great, of course we will. That's ridiculous. Absolutely, that should not happen. Absolutely not.
And if they're in a position where they're taking subjects at A level that they got a D in at GCSE, A levels probably aren't for them, if we're being honest.
Yeah.
And I think the alternative routes and paths for students are so often demeaned and put down and overlooked, and it's a shame. Like, an apprenticeship would be miles better for them for this exact reason. You know, it's right, they might not pick it up straight away, they might not, but when they've learned it, they're going to be just as capable of someone who did it quickly.
Gotcha. I mean, it's and it's a shame, like you say, that there's this stigma around certain paths, as if the idea of do a GCSE, do an A level, do a degree, get a job is like the pinnacle. And then anything else, you know, there's so much sneering about people who go for these alternate strategies and go for these different qualifications. But actually, you know, let's say I've got a student at GCSE, they're getting, I don't know, B's and C's or C's and D's, and I say, how are you getting on? And they say, you know, I really want into nursing. Nursing's what I want to get into. All my friends are off to do, they're going to do A level. You know, I'm excited to do A levels as well, and then I'll go to get my nursing degree, and I'll go from there. And I just look and think, that shouldn't be your route in. If you're getting C's and D's, you know, I get what your friends are doing, but it's time to make that decision. Do you want to just band around with your friends for 2 years, or are you actually really passionate about this? Is this a vocation for you? If so, you need to, you know, metagaming the system and saying, what routes are available in? What do I want to do? What is going to be the path that allows me to progress at my rate? Because we're talking about how to make good progress, but like, what is good progress for a student? Maybe this is a good way to kind of summarize and wrap up at the end. Like, what are we defining as good progress?
I mean, at the end of the day, the difficulty for us is that they're all being assessed in the same way. Good progress will always be measured on an exam at the end of the course, and that will be ultimately where you are being judged for the progress of your class, and where the students are being judged for their progress over 2 years. And it's not always, in a perfect world, we'd say, you know, oh, well, and I was thinking about with your nurse analogy, if you were given two student nurses, one of whom was sort of at the end of a 2-year course, and their course was very hands-on. They'd put, you know, IV drips in countless times over the course of their course, and they were putting an IV drip into you, or whether you've been given another student who'd passed it, got a 90% on the how to put an IV written exam. You know.
I'm with you. I think I'm with you. I mean, I guess to some extent it's a simplification. I'm sure you'd be upsetting some nurses who are saying, "Hold on a minute, there's clinicals and practicals in my degree as well."
Yeah, I know.
But I get what you're saying.
It might not be the best example, but you get the point.
No, I'm with you. And I feel like to some extent, I guess it's the responsibility of schools to get away from that idea of how many kids did we send to Russell Group universities this year. And start saying, actually, what is best for my students? Are we, I remember when I was at sixth form, there were plenty of times when we'd visit Manchester University or Lancaster University or Leeds University, and we'd go to these Russell Group universities and things to have a look around because the school really wanted to be able to say, so many of our alumni go off to these places.
Yeah.
Whereas, I don't remember ever having a careers day where they got people in from all different walks of life, from all different professions, and people who got into those professions, get 3 or 4 nurses in, people who, I don't know, left school and had a career and came to it later, people who got in with work experience, people who got in through the degree route, whatever it is, and let them chat with students, let them have a conversation and show that actually there isn't a stigma. If you get to where you want to get in life, then you've made good progress.
Yeah, good job, you've nailed it. If at the end of the day, if you wanted to be a nurse and you're an experienced nurse, does it really matter whether you went through the academic route or not? If No,
I don't think it does.
And especially, there's a point to be made here about degrees as well. If you've gone to end up in a job where you didn't need to go to university, was your degree worth getting? That's always an interesting conversation.
Especially these days. Especially these days at like 9 to 10 grand a year before living expenses.
Yeah.
Plenty of people go for the experience, and if you want to spend that on an experience, I think whatever, you can do that if you want.
Yeah,
but
save the money and go on a really cool holiday, travel for a year.
Absolutely,
probably cost you less. University can be an expensive waste of time if you're not going with a clear idea where you want to end up.
Really can, but again, maybe this is a conversation for a future podcast.
This is the whole point of long form podcasting. You end up it's a secure, not necessarily a direct route from A to B.
That's true. You do get down some tangents.
We've tangented real good. My students pride themselves on their ability to take me off on a tangent. They just ask me a really interesting question about neutron stars, and it gets me every time.
I imagine it's not difficult at all to get you off on a tangent.
So, will you tell us about the zone of proximal development? Can I?
Will I?
Yeah.
Will I?
Forget about the rest of the lesson. Buckle up, kids.
They've heard it 20 times, so ironically, not remotely in the old ZPD for them.
Yeah, it's easy mode for them, but who cares?
And on that bombshell, progress, who cares? Maybe we should pull it to a close there. So I think the next one we're going to do is on teaching standard number 3, which is about subject knowledge. And I guess we'll see you then. See you later.
Yeah, thanks, folks. Bye-bye.